In 1950, most African Americans were still treated unfairly and not given the same rights as white people. Jim Crow laws in the South kept black people separated from white people. But in the 1950s, a movement called the Civil Rights Movement began. This was when black people started working to be treated more fairly in America. World War II played a big role in starting this movement. First, because so many white men were fighting in the war, there were job openings for African Americans. Second, during the war, civil rights groups fought against unfair laws and for the right to vote. President Franklin Roosevelt also made a rule that said federal agencies and companies working on the war couldn't discriminate against people based on race. Third, almost 1 million African Americans served in the military during the war. They fought for freedom in Europe, and when they came back, they wanted freedom for themselves too. World War II showed African Americans that they deserved to be treated equally. After the war, many were determined to make things better for themselves. Even before the civil rights movement started, African American lawyers were fighting against unfair treatment in court. In 1938, a group of lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall started arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court. Their most important win happened in 1954 with the case called Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court decided that having separate schools for white and black students was unfair and against the Constitution. Some communities in the South didn't agree with the Brown decision. In 1955, the Supreme Court made another ruling telling schools to mix students faster. A big problem happened in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor, Orville Faubus, didn't want 9 black students to go to Central High School. President Eisenhower sent soldiers to let them go to school. These students were called the Little Rock Nine. School wasn't the only place where black people fought against segregation. They also stood up against unfair rules on city buses. In Montgomery, Alabama, there was a law saying black people had to give their seats to white people. In 1955, Rosa Parks got arrested for not giving her seat to a white person. After Parks got arrested, black people in Montgomery didn't ride the buses for a whole year. They wanted someone to lead their protest, and they chose Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a pastor. The protest lasted 381 days. Finally, in late 1956, the Supreme Court said that segregated buses were against the law. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in using nonviolent resistance, which he called soul force. He got inspiration from different people. He learned to love his enemies from Jesus and about civil disobedience from writer Henry David Thoreau, which means not following unfair laws. He also learned about organizing big protests from A. Philip Randolph, and from Mohandas Gandhi, he learned that you can fight against unfair treatment without violence. In 1957, King and other leaders formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to use peaceful protests to change how people thought about integrating black and white people. Another group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was formed by college students in 1960. They thought changes for black people were happening too slowly. One protest strategy SNCC used was the sit-in. During a sit-in, black people sat at lunch counters meant only for white people and stayed until they were served. In February 1960, African American students did a sit-in at a Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina, even though white people hit them and poured food on them. By late 1960, students had desegregated lunch counters in 48 cities in 11 states.